My name is Nora Barnes, and the night my family decided I didn't belong to them anymore didn't happen in some courtroom or after months of legal fighting. It happened at a Christmas dinner. One moment I was sitting at the table, silent, unseen, and the next my sister was rising to her feet, lifting her glass like she was about to make a toast. Instead, she delivered a verdict. She announced, loud enough for every fork to stop midair, "We voted, and you're not family anymore." And they cheered. Actual applause, as if cutting me out of my own bloodline was some generous act of community service. I didn't gasp. I didn't argue. I didn't beg them to reconsider. Because while they only had a vote, I had something else entirely. I remember feeling strangely calm as I reached into my bag. My hands weren't shaking. My voice didn't crack. I simply slid a plain folder across the table, right toward the person who'd worked the hardest to destroy me. "Then," I said, "I guess you won't need this." She opened it. She barely made it past the first page before her face collapsed into panic. Her breath caught. Her chair scraped backward. And then she screamed. A raw, breaking sound that silenced the entire room faster than her announcement ever could. Every relative who'd clapped for my exile froze. No one yet understood what was in that folder, but they would. And after that night, none of their lives would look the same again, especially hers. Before I tell you what happened next, and why that folder changed everything, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? I'd love to know how far this story reaches. The shift in my life began in a way that didn't seem dramatic at first. Just a small tremor beneath the surface, the kind you only recognize later, after it has quietly rearranged the shape of everything you thought was stable. 5 years before that Christmas dinner, the foundation of my world changed when my father, Richard Barnes, experienced complications after what was supposed to be a routine heart procedure. The surgery itself went well, but the aftermath didn't. Something in him slowed, as if his mind were falling a step behind his body and struggling to catch up. The first signs were subtle. He repeated stories he'd told me the day before. He paused mid-sentence, unable to find the simplest word. He misplaced his keys, then forgot he was even looking for them. I remember watching him scan the kitchen with a puzzled expression, his hand on the counter like he needed to steady himself against confusion rather than gravity. It wasn't like him. Not the man who had always been sharp, organized, and meticulously aware of every detail of his life. When the doctors confirmed that the cognitive strain wasn't temporary, that he would need consistent care, the air in the room felt heavier. They explained it gently, with that blend of kindness and caution that lets you know the truth is worse than the tone suggests. He would need someone. Every day. Every week. Indefinitely. Someone who understood his routines and could adapt when those routines faded or fractured. The question of who hung in the air for only a moment, but it felt long enough for me to understand what everyone else already knew. I was the only person whose life could bend without breaking. I was single, living in a small apartment I didn't love, working a job that allowed remote arrangements. There was no spouse to negotiate with, no children depending on me, no rigid commitments I couldn't shift. And my father, this man who had been stable ground for me my entire life, was suddenly standing on unsteady footing. So I made the decision that felt less like a choice and more like a path unfolding beneath me. I packed my belongings into a few boxes, ended the lease on my apartment, and moved back into the house I had grown up in. Overnight, familiar spaces became unfamiliar responsibilities. The living room wasn't just a living room anymore. It was a place where I learned to track subtle changes in his behavior. The kitchen became a station for organizing medications and charting times. His bedroom turned into a landscape where I memorized every sound he made in the night, ready in case he woke disoriented or afraid. At first, he resisted help. Richard Barnes had always been proud, steady, habit-driven. Losing control of his memory frustrated him more than any physical limitation. He apologized constantly, apologized when he forgot to turn off the stove, when he misread the mail, when he left the TV loud because he couldn't remember which remote controlled the volume. I kept telling him he didn't need to be sorry, but I knew each slip cut into him. My days began to revolve around anticipating the moments when he might falter. I learned the exact time his energy dipped, the hour he became more forgetful, the subtle cues that told me he was drifting into old memories again. Some days he thought I was still in college. Other days he asked whether his own father was visiting for dinner. Those moments always hit me hardest, not because he didn't recognize our timeline, but because he spoke with such sincerity that correcting him felt like erasing a memory he was trying so desperately to hold on to. Still, there were bright moments woven into the difficult ones. Times when he was clear, fully present, and unmistakably himself. He would share stories from his childhood, stories I had never heard before. Like the illness had loosened a vault of memories he'd kept tightly sealed. We cooked simple meals together, mostly out of habit rather than necessity, and he always insisted on seasoning things his way, even when he immediately forgot which spice he had used. Caring for him changed me in ways I didn't recognize at the time. My world became quieter, smaller, shaped around the rhythms of his mind rather than my own ambitions. But within that narrowing came a deeper closeness than we had ever shared. Each day, each routine, each moment of confusion and clarity alike created a bond that felt both fragile and unshakable. I didn't think of myself as giving something up. I thought of it as giving something back to the man who had once supported every step of my life and now needed someone to steady his. I didn't realize how quickly life could pivot until the day everything shifted again. It happened on an afternoon when the house felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that almost invites you to notice something out of place. I had stepped out to run errands, leaving my father, Richard Barnes, resting comfortably after a morning of routine tasks. When I returned, I found him seated at the dining table, a stack of papers in front of him, and a firmness in his posture I hadn't seen in a long time. There was no hesitation in his expression, no confusion clouding his features. He looked up at me with a clarity that startled me, as if a window had opened briefly in his mind and he intended to use the moment with complete intention. The documents had already been signed, and his pen rested neatly beside them. I didn't know yet what he had done, but the air around him carried the weight of a decision he had reached alone, one he had chosen not to include me in until after the fact. He told me he had made arrangements. He said it calmly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. But there was a gravity in his voice that told me these weren't ordinary arrangements or minor adjustments. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as though each word required careful placement to make sure nothing slipped away or became muddled. I listened as he explained that the time had come for him to reorganize what he called the final responsibilities of his life. He didn't use dramatic language or poetic phrasing. He simply stated that he needed to make sure the things he cherished most would be cared for when he no longer could. Then he told me he had revised his will. Hearing those words made something tighten inside my chest. Not fear, exactly, but a quiet ache rooted in the reality we had been trying to navigate together. He didn't speak about death often. He knew I avoided the subject. But on that day, he pushed past the discomfort because he believed clarity mattered more than emotion. He explained that he had contacted Attorney Keller, a man he trusted deeply, to come to the house while I was gone. He didn't want me there for the signing because he didn't want me to feel pressured or implicated in any way. The decision had to be his alone, guided by his own judgment, even if that judgment sometimes flickered. But on that day, it hadn't flickered at all. He spoke about the years I had spent adjusting my life to care for him. He acknowledged shifts I never brought up, sacrifices he had quietly noticed, and the steady presence I maintained even on the difficult days. He talked about loyalty not as an abstract value, but as something he had witnessed every morning with his first cup of coffee, and every night when I checked on him before sleeping. Then he told me he had decided to leave the house to me. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what to say. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a space filled with memories, echoes, and the entire history of our family. Taking it felt like stepping into a role I wasn't sure I had earned, even though I had spent every day learning how to carry his weight alongside my own. He continued speaking, quiet, unwavering, resolute. He wanted me to have security, something tangible that reflected not only his gratitude, but his belief that I had earned stability rather than borrowed it from circumstance. He made it clear that the decision wasn't meant to diminish anyone else, but rather to acknowledge the reality we had lived in together. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to justify anything. He simply made it known that fairness, to him, didn't always look equal. I felt humbled, overwhelmed, and oddly unprepared. I told him it wasn't necessary. I told him that caring for him had never been tied to inheritance or obligation, but he shook his head with a certainty that wasn't open to discussion. He reminded me that he was still capable of making choices that reflected his values. That afternoon became a dividing line in my life, the point at which his gratitude took shape as something permanent, something written, something no longer just implied through gestures or phrases. I didn't know then how much turmoil that decision would eventually unleash. I only knew that in that moment he was steady, lucid, and offering a gift shaped by honesty. And I understood why he needed to make the decision while clarity was still within reach. The tension began surfacing in ways I hadn't anticipated. It started with small interruptions, phone calls I hadn't expected, polite messages that carried an undercurrent of discomfort, and distant relatives reaching out with questions they had never cared enough to ask before. At first, I didn't understand why people I barely knew suddenly seemed invested in my life, but their unusual concern gradually revealed a motive that wasn't their own. The shift in tone from polite curiosity to subtle accusation didn't happen all at once. It crept in, steady and quiet, until it was impossible to ignore. My sister, Hannah Barnes Whitfield, had begun shaping a narrative. I didn't witness the first conversations she had with family members. I only saw the aftermath, the transformation of attitudes from warmth to uncertainty. A few relatives attempted to hide their doubts with forced friendliness, while others chose to keep their distance entirely. The change wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was unmistakable, like a fabric slowly unraveling thread by thread. Eventually, I realized that Hannah had begun calling people, speaking in careful, measured tones that likely sounded genuine to anyone who didn't know her patterns as well as I did. She had always been skilled at presenting herself as composed and thoughtful, especially when she wanted something. It wasn't difficult to imagine her voicing her concerns, lowering her voice at the right moments, feigning reluctance to bring up a sensitive matter. She knew exactly how to plant doubt, without appearing to sow it. One afternoon, Aunt Linda contacted me unexpectedly. Her message was short and polite, but the implication behind her words left no room for misunderstanding. She wanted to know if I planned to revisit the terms of my father's will, because in her view, family harmony depended on fairness. She didn't accuse me of anything directly, but her phrasing carried the unmistakable assumption that my position was the problem. Not long after that, Uncle Mark reached out with a tone that felt more confrontational. He insisted that my father couldn't have been thinking clearly, that I must have misunderstood his intentions, that the house should have been kept available for everyone. He emphasized that I needed to avoid benefiting from confusion, words so pointed they left me momentarily stunned. And it didn't stop there. A few distant cousins sent messages laced with disappointment, expressing how sad it was to see conflict caused by selfishness. Others didn't bother speaking to me directly. Instead, They posted vague statements online, remarks about loyalty, unity, and honoring the true wishes of parents. No names were mentioned, but the references were far from subtle. Each new message made it more apparent that a coordinated effort was underway. Hannah's influence flowed through the family like a whisper carried from room to room, altering perceptions long before I had the chance to defend myself. People I had welcomed into my home now viewed me as someone capable of manipulation, someone who exploited vulnerability for personal gain. I never imagined that caring for my father would become ammunition against me. As the days passed, the weight of their assumptions grew heavier. It wasn't just their doubt that hurt. It was the realization that many of them were willing to believe the worst without seeking clarity from me. They accepted Hannah's version of events without question, trusting her narrative over my years of quiet commitment. I tried to maintain calm. I reminded myself of the truth, of the promises my father made when he was fully aware, of the closeness we had built during the years I cared for him. But even with all that, the steady drip of criticism began eroding my sense of stability. There were evenings I sat alone in the living room, scrolling through the messages I chose not to reply to, wondering how quickly trust can dissolve when someone decides to poison it. There was one moment I remember clearly, standing in the hallway near the photographs of my parents, trying to understand how everything had shifted so drastically. The quietness of the house contrasted sharply with the noise generated by those who claimed to know what was best for it. A narrative had been created around me, and I was trapped inside it whether I liked it or not. The campaign against me continued to expand, gaining momentum with every person who accepted Hannah's framing without question. And with each passing week, I felt the distance widening between myself and the people I once believed would stand beside me. It was the first time I truly saw how convincing a lie can become when repeated by enough voices. And it was the moment I realized my sister wasn't just disagreeing with my father's decision. She was erasing the truth entirely. A quiet evening became the turning point in a way I hadn't expected. I was sorting through a set of old boxes that had been tucked into the closet of my father's former home office, a space I had avoided for months because of the emotional weight it carried. The boxes held files, receipts, and documents he had saved over the years, organized in the meticulous way that defined him before his health declined. My intention had been simple: reduce the clutter and create order where things had begun to drift out of place. As I worked through the stacks, something caught my attention. A thin envelope, different from the rest, rested between folders labeled with dates from years prior. It wasn't marked in my father's handwriting, and the unfamiliarity of it drew me in immediately. When I opened it, I found a collection of bank statements covering several months. At first glance, they looked like typical records: transactions, balances, routine details. Nothing alarming, but a pattern began to emerge as I compared the pages more closely. There were withdrawals that didn't align with his spending habits, transfers to an account I didn't recognize, large sums removed at intervals that didn't match his usual rhythm. My father had always been prudent with his finances, even after his health began to fail. These irregularities didn't match the man I knew or the behavior I had observed while caring for him. I separated the questionable entries and spread them across the desk. Each one felt like a puzzle piece demanding a place in a picture I hadn't yet seen. The more I compared, the more uneasy I became. The same account number appeared on multiple statements, each time linked to a withdrawal significantly higher than my father would have ever made without purpose. The realization struck slowly, like an unwelcome truth forming from fragments you'd rather ignore. When I traced the account number using publicly available information through the bank's customer assistance line, the confirmation came. It was registered to Hannah Barnes Whitfield. For a while, I simply sat there, unable to move. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself thickened under the weight of betrayal. I couldn't explain away the transactions or pretend they had innocent origins. The documentation was clear: precise, indisputable. Money had been taken, systematically, repeatedly, at a time when my father's clarity had already been slipping. I continued searching through the box, hoping there would be something else, something that countered what I had uncovered. Instead, I found additional evidence, more statements, printouts, and notes my father had written in the margins. The handwriting wasn't always steady, but it was unmistakably his. The comments hinted at confusion and concern, small phrases suggesting he had questioned the missing funds, but couldn't fully track what had occurred. Seeing those notes felt like a blow I hadn't been prepared for. My father had noticed enough to try piecing it together, yet not enough to protect himself. He had been vulnerable during a time when he should have been supported, and instead, someone he trusted had taken advantage of his weakened state. I gathered every document and organized them into a folder. I highlighted dates, circled amounts, and arranged the pages so the progression of the financial loss could be understood clearly. Each page reflected a choice someone had made, a choice to withdraw, to transfer, to conceal. Before taking any further steps, I contacted Attorney Keller, the person who had handled my father's legal matters. I explained what I had found, providing only the facts, keeping emotion out of my voice as much as possible. He asked me to bring everything to his office so he could review the records carefully. His tone was measured but firm, suggesting that the evidence pointed towards something serious, an issue that extended beyond family conflict. After the call, I returned to the office and stared at the folder lying on the desk. It felt like a symbol of everything that had quietly unraveled beneath the surface. While I had been caring for my father every day, another part of his life had been stripped away without my knowledge. The truth in those pages was undeniable. It didn't ask for interpretation or speculation. It simply existed, stark and clear. And I understood, with a heaviness that settled deep in my chest, that nothing about my sister's hostility had been rooted in misunderstanding. It had been rooted in fear, fear of what would happen when the truth finally came to light. The evening unfolded with a kind of forced harmony that felt fragile from the moment I stepped through the doorway. People were gathered throughout the house, exchanging greetings and smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Conversations drifted from room to room, each one layered with tension I could feel long before anyone acknowledged my presence. Decorations glimmered along the walls, but their brightness couldn't soften the stiffness in the air. I moved through the familiar spaces with a steady calm, understanding more than anyone suspected. The dining room held an energy that felt almost ceremonial. Chairs had been arranged with deliberate precision, as though the seating itself carried meaning. I took my place quietly, observing the subtle glances in my direction, curiosity from some, discomfort from others, and unmistakable judgment from a few who had already chosen their stance long before the night began. No one spoke directly to me at first. Their silence formed a barrier stronger than words, a collective agreement to keep their distance until someone else initiated the confrontation they were all anticipating. Plates were passed, dishes were served, and the room filled with the sound of silverware tapping lightly against porcelain, a mechanical rhythm that separated their world from mine. Then she rose. Hannah stood with a confidence that seemed rehearsed, as if she had practiced the precise angle of her posture, the measured calm in her expression, the authoritative tone she planned to use. Her presence drew every pair of eyes toward her, and a hush settled over the table with startling ease. Even the children sensed something unusual and fell silent. She didn't look at me, not at first. Instead, she directed her gaze across the room, as though addressing an audience gathered to witness an important announcement. Her voice carried a steadiness that masked the turmoil she must have felt, but the edges of her confidence were sharper than necessary, revealing the strain beneath her composure. With a poised breath, she declared that she had gathered the family to discuss what she called an issue of unity. She spoke about responsibility, about loyalty, about honoring the values our father had supposedly cherished. Every sentence was crafted to present herself as a guardian of integrity, someone acting only in service of the greater good. Those who trusted her already nodded along, accepting her authority without hesitation. When she finally turned toward me, the room seemed to shrink. Her expression shifted into something colder, more pointed, a look that suggested she was delivering justice, not judgment. She stated that a decision had been made, that conversations had taken place privately, and that the group had reached a conclusion meant to restore balance. Then she announced the words she had been waiting to say. "We voted, and you're not family anymore." I felt the weight of the moment, but not the sting she expected. A muted applause rose from a portion of the table, a sound that barely registered through the calm that settled within me. Their reaction didn't surprise me. Their alliance with her had been clear for months. What they didn't know was that I hadn't walked into that room unprepared. The silence that followed their clapping created a vacuum, an opening into which the truth could finally be placed. Without rushing, without raising my voice, I reached into my bag and removed the folder I had assembled with painstaking care. I placed it gently onto the table, sliding it forward until it rested directly in front of the person who had orchestrated the entire spectacle. "Then you won't need this," I said, my tone even, not mocking, not shaken, simply factual. The shift in Hannah's expression was immediate. Curiosity flickered first, followed by apprehension she attempted to disguise. She opened the folder and her eyes passed over the first page. Confusion tightened into fear, and her composure began to unravel. Her breathing changed. The room leaned closer without meaning to, drawn toward the transformation happening right in front of them. She turned another page, then another, and the color drained from her face. The proof was clear. There was no interpretation left to manipulate, no angle to twist. The documents laid out a truth she had hoped would remain hidden. A fractured sound escaped her, sharp, involuntary, and the room fell utterly silent. Chairs stopped moving. Forks froze midair. The very people who had applauded moments earlier now stared in stunned stillness. Every page she touched was a consequence she had created. And for the first time all evening, she understood she no longer controlled the narrative. In the weeks that followed, the silence spreading through the family felt heavier than any confrontation could have been. The aftermath arrived not with chaos, but with a strange, quiet clarity. Each person retreated into their own reckoning, and the house where the truth had been exposed became a marker for a turning point none of us could reverse. I moved through those days with a steadiness that surprised even me, as though some part of my mind had always anticipated this collapse and had simply waited for everyone else to catch up. The first ripples of consequence surfaced almost immediately. Relatives who once viewed themselves as spectators realized that neutrality had been a luxury they could no longer claim. Their shifting behavior revealed the discomfort of people who finally understood the weight of their own choices. They did not approach me with excuses. Instead, they carried with them a kind of wordless remorse. I accepted their distance as a form of honesty they had lacked before. As for Hannah, her world cracked open in ways she had never prepared for. The collapse was not dramatic. It was incremental, practical, and painfully real. Her carefully curated life could not withstand scrutiny from those closest to her. Trust drained from her marriage until separation became unavoidable. Financial inquiries followed, each one carving deeper into the structure she had built around illusion. I watched it unfold without interference, recognizing that consequences sometimes emerge naturally when deception meets exposure. I felt no triumph in it, only the inevitability of a truth that refused to stay hidden. My own life settled into a rhythm I had not experienced in years. The house became a place of balance rather than burden. I unpacked memories slowly, letting them breathe in rooms that had once felt haunted by expectation. The quiet allowed me to rediscover parts of myself I'd long pushed aside: the resilience, the independence, the steady resolve that had guided me through caretaking and loss. Unexpectedly, connections began forming at the edges of my new routine. People who had once kept their distance reached out with sincerity rather than pressure. Their apologies felt different this time. Not performative, not driven by guilt, but shaped by understanding. I accepted these gestures cautiously, choosing to rebuild trust only where consistency aligned with intention. The family dynamic shifted into something less cohesive yet more truthful, and that distinction felt important. Still, there remained a part of me that understood a chapter had closed permanently. My relationship with Hannah existed now only in memory, and I allowed it to remain there without bitterness. There was nothing left to salvage. Her absence brought a kind of peace I had not realized I needed until it settled fully into place. On quiet evenings, I found myself reflecting on the long arc of events that had led me here. The years of caretaking, the isolation, the accusations, the moment of exposure that changed everything. None of it felt disconnected. Each part formed a progression that taught me how to stand firmly in my own truth. I did not ask for gratitude, nor did I expect acknowledgement. What mattered was the understanding I carried within myself, an understanding shaped not by validation from others, but by my own integrity. Gradually, the holidays took on a new shape. The gatherings were smaller but warmer, grounded in authenticity rather than obligation. I surrounded myself with people who valued presence more than performance. The house, once a battleground for conflict and inheritance, transformed into a place where laughter carried without effort. The contrast felt like a reward I had never sought but certainly needed. And somewhere in that transformation, I found space for reflection, not nostalgia, not resentment, but perspective. I recognized the importance of boundaries and the necessity of choosing peace, even when others demand chaos. I understood the strength in protecting one's own narrative and the freedom that comes with refusing to carry someone else's falsehoods. In the end, the story left me with a lesson I could not ignore. Family is not guaranteed by blood, proximity, or history. It is earned through honesty, accountability, and the willingness to show up when it matters. And perhaps most importantly, peace is worth protecting, even if it requires walking away from the people who believed they had the right to define your worth. This was not a victory. It was clarity. And clarity, I learned, can change everything.